Hey everybody, I want to do a short video about the second coming of Jesus Christ, and I want to just talk briefly about a couple of Bible prophecy events that we can see happening right now in our current day, and this is why I think that we are closer than ever. You know, we can read in a couple of passages like 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 about the resurrection event. In those two passages, it describes very clearly what the resurrection is going to look like and the order of the resurrection. In other words, who's going to go first, who's going to go second. And then we can read very clear detail of how it's going to happen. It's also talked about in Revelation chapter 20. And I want to begin in Matthew chapter 24, where Jesus is talking to his disciples, and his disciples come to Jesus with a very specific question. They ask him, "What will the signs be at your second coming?" And so Jesus spends all of chapter 24 answering that question. Now remember, they were asking him about his return. They're not asking him about a secret rapture. They're not asking him about anything else other than his return to this earth. Okay, so everything that he says to them is in reference to that specific event of his return. And when you read through that passage, he talks about, Jesus does, about watching out for false messiahs. He talks about natural disasters like earthquakes. He talks about wars and rumors of wars. And all those things we've seen since Jesus' time. But one thing he talks about in this response to his disciples is that we will know that the time is growing close to his return when we see those things speed up and get more intense and get closer together, like birth pains. He describes them as birth pains. And we know birth pains are just like that. They start out not as strong and further apart, and the closer the baby comes to being born, the stronger the birth pains are, the closer they are together, the more intense they are. And Jesus said all these things will happen in this manner. Now, one thing that he does talk about that is very important for us to understand in concerning when he will come back, he says that at the end, the gospel will be preached into all the world. Now, just to put that in context, we are looking at an estimation of around the year 2030, somewhere around there. It could be a year or two sooner. It could be a year or two later. But around 2030, it is projected that the gospel will be presented to every people group throughout the world. And yes, that includes the tribes out in the deepest, darkest jungle. That was the one thing that Jesus said, that the end will come. In other words, the end of human government and his return when that happens. And then he goes on to describe events that will happen in the tribulation time, specifically the back half, the final 3.5 years of the tribulation. And he says great persecution will break out when the Antichrist stands in the temple and desecrates the temple by claiming that he is God. And he references Daniel. And we know in Daniel chapter 9, it talks about this. It also talks about it in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, which I'm going to talk about in just a few minutes. But first, I want to continue into Matthew 24. And then Jesus talks about something else. He says that the generation that is alive to see these things happen should know that they will see the second coming of Christ. And he speaks specifically about a fig tree, and he uses that as a reference to as an example of the season that we're going to be in, and he says, when we see the leaves blooming on the fig tree, we know the summer is coming. He says, when we see all these other things, we know that the second coming is just right around the corner. It's interesting, he mentions generation. The generation that is alive to see these things will also see the second coming of Christ. Now, I want us to talk just briefly about a generation, and specifically in relation to Israel. Jesus was talking about a generation that would be alive to see the nation of Israel reborn and to be alive again as a nation. That, of course, we know that happened in 1948. In the year 2028, it'll be 80 years since the nation of Israel became a nation. Is generally believed that a biblical generation is somewhere around 80 years. Now, we do have some specific references of a specific generation that was shorter. We actually have one that was a little longer. But just in theory, most believe that 80 years is a good number, 70 to 80 years. We're quickly approaching that 80-year mark of a generation. In other words, that generation that saw Israel become a nation in 1948, they are approaching that 80-year window. So we put that, it's like on top of another thing. It's like in an equation, a math equation, an addition, for example. You use 1 + 1 is 2, plus 3 is 5, plus 9 is 14, right? You keep adding on. And when we look at these things that Jesus talked about, we just keep adding on, and all of them just point to and magnify the fact that we are very close to the second coming of Jesus Christ. Let's go back to those birth pains and everything that we're seeing around the world. We're seeing the uptick in earthquakes, not just earthquakes, but devastating earthquakes, natural disasters of all kind. We're seeing, he also talked about, which I haven't mentioned yet, just the moral decay in the world. He said it'll be like the days of Noah, and we know that back in Noah's day, the world was so corrupt and so just morally bankrupt that God just had enough, and he had to start over again. And Jesus said right before he comes back that the world will be like that. Well, the world is like that today. Everything that is considered sin by God seems to be approved by society, and vice versa. If you stand for truth and say, hey, God has something to say about this, then you get backlash for it. You get persecution for it. It's exactly the way Jesus said it would be. Romans chapter 1 is a good example of what it looks like, a society looks like when they reject God. We see a fast track towards a world that is pushing God out of it and believing that it can solve all the world's problems in their own understanding, and what the world is really doing is just making things worse. You ever wonder why wars continue to happen and division and the things that we see in the world today? It's because we've rejected God as a world, and we have decided to put ourselves in the place of God. We have to have a foundation of truth that's greater than ourselves. If we don't, it's just mass chaos. And that's what we see right now, is mass chaos. Because what's right for you may not be right for me. And who's to say who's right and who's wrong, right? Did you get that? God says there is a right and wrong. And this is why we have to come to him and his understanding of what right and wrong is. It gets us on the same page. Does that make sense? So Jesus said in the last days, it'll be like the days of Noah, just moral bankruptcy and chaos and wars and rumors of wars and famines, pestilences. We're seeing all this stuff happening. And then Jesus talks about at his second coming in Matthew 24, he gives a description of the resurrection. And he says that he will send his angels out to collect his chosen people. And then he talks again later on about one will be left in the field, another one will be taken. He's referring to the resurrection. So Jesus is saying that the resurrection is going to happen at or right at his second coming, not before the tribulation, not any other time sooner than at the end of the tribulation. Now let's move into 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Just if you'll read the first 12 verses of that, I think you'll find that it's very clearly stated there, the timing of Jesus's return. In that passage, it talks about things that are going to happen before he comes back. Now, it's interesting, Paul, the Apostle Paul, who's the author of 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and also 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, is also the author of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Now, why do I bring up those other two passages of 1 Corinthians 15 and 1 Thessalonians 4? It's because Paul is describing the resurrection event. We might call it the rapture event, but it's the resurrection event. It's the first of two resurrections, it says in Revelation chapter 20. There's only two. I'm putting my fingers up here so you can see. There's only two resurrections, the Bible says in Revelation chapter 20. The first happens at the beginning of Jesus's 1,000-year reign on this world when he comes back. Okay? I said that slowly because I wanted to make sure that I said it clearly. When Jesus comes back, he's going to reign on this world for 1,000 years. And that's what he meant by the end will come. In other words, he will come and he'll put an end to human government. And he will set up his kingdom and he will rule this world. So when the Bible says in Revelation 20 that when he comes back, the first of two resurrections will happen. It's the same event as Paul recorded in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and 1 Corinthians 15, and also is mentioned in 2 Thessalonians 2. Now, what was happening in the church at Thessalonica is that they were being told that they had missed the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord is a reference to the second coming of Jesus. And they were confused. So Paul was writing to that church to unconfuse them, to make it clear to them that they had not missed it. And he was very specific in what he said. He said that I am writing to you about the day of the Lord, about his return. And he says, and, listen very carefully, and the gathering of his people to him. Now, those are my words, but it's the gathering, us gathering to him. That rapture, that resurrection. That's what he's talking about. So he's talking about two things are not going to happen until we see something before that. The second coming and the rapture, the resurrection. Now he goes on to say that there's something very important that has to happen first before those two things happen. He describes an event that Jesus described in Matthew chapter 24 about Daniel's prophecy in Daniel chapter 9, when he said that first, before Jesus returns and we are gathered unto him, we have to see the Antichrist stand in the temple and defame the temple and proclaim himself as God. So, Jesus' return and our gathering unto him cannot happen until we see that. And when that happens, that's 3.5 years into the tribulation. We know that the tribulation begins from a peace treaty that is signed between Israel and the many. The many could be a lot of nations, a lot of Arab nations, but we think we'll know for sure when the Palestinians join the Abraham Accords. They may call it something different than the Abraham Accords, but there's a strong movement right now for those Abraham Accords to be pushed on the Palestinians and the Saudis and to form a coalition there of peace. And when that happens, that will begin the 7 years. We know that out of Daniel chapter 9. Then, 3.5 years into that tribulation, we know out of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 that a temple will be built, which, by the way, is part of the Abraham Accords. It doesn't specify the temple being rebuilt, but it talks about the Temple Mount in the Abraham Accords. And it says that all three of the world's major religions Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all three should be allowed to worship on the Temple Mount as their faiths dictate. For the Jews, their faith dictates they have a temple. It's the Temple Mount. So on the Temple Mount, we will see when this peace treaty is signed that the Jews will be allowed to build their temple beside the mosque, and that Christians will have a place to worship there too. This is going to happen, and it's going to happen very soon. When this happens, we know that we're in the tribulation. And the Bible says in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 that 3.5 years into that final 7 years, the halfway point, the Antichrist, we will know who he is at this point, because he will stand in the Jewish temple and he will proclaim himself to be God, defiling the temple. And then we know that Jesus will return 3.5 years from that point. So I just wanted to bring this up and get you thinking about the second coming and about when we'll be gathered unto him, because it's very important that we have a good understanding of what's ahead of us. We shouldn't live in fear. We should live in hope. And we need to, as it says in Hebrews chapter 10, that we need to not forsake gathering together as some have done, right? Because we have to affirm the hope that we have in Jesus Christ, and we have to hold tightly to that he's coming back. That's what's going to get us through the difficult times ahead of us, and we are right on the cusp of that final 7 years beginning. There's so much going on in the world. It's not just the Russia-Ukraine war. It's not just COVID. It's everything together. And the peace talks they're so close now. And the Palestinians are starting to move towards this idea of peace with Israel. And we're also seeing the World Economic Forum push their agenda, and their agenda is to to have by 2030 to have all these things in place, a one world economy, a one world government, all these things to be in place. They're talking about putting microchips in the brains of every human being by 2026. There's just so much stuff going on. We are so close, and Jesus says that we'll see all these things happen right before he comes back. So think about these things. If you have any questions, reach out to me. I'd love to answer your questions. And thank you for watching. Have a good day.